Good morning to all of you. You are very welcome to this session on poverty and the role of social research and social policy. It is very pleasant to me to be here and share with you this opportunity of getting together to understand one of the most complex objects we have in social sciences, poverty and poverty-related issues. This session was born out of the cooperation of three institutions, CROP, CODESRIA, and CLACSO. We try to bring in different perspectives in the belief that meaningful knowledge is produced by the convergence of different perspectives. You will see a panel with different people coming from three different continents and different parts of those three continents, trying to share their views, both theoretical and methodological view, but also the standpoints that came from where you stand in life. They stand in different parts of the world, sustaining different perspectives of this world. And this is the way we understand knowledge in our meaningful cooperation that has been growing and growing for the past 8 and 9 years. This is not only the CLACSO-CROP cooperation. We was doing kind of support of serious scientific research in the field of poverty in Latin America, and now we're expanding to our other parts of the continent. But also I'm referring to the CODESRIA-CLACSO cooperation through the South-South program. I just have 1 minute. Asuncion Sancler, who is going to be the chair, gave me that small time. But this is enough to say welcome to you all. We are very glad to be here, and let's move on. Asuncion, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Alberto. That was a very nice use of your 1 minute. Welcome, everybody, on my behalf. I'm Asun Lera Sinclair, Scientific Director of CROP, and I'm delighted to really chair this session. So I'm going to explain very quickly the rules of the game. We have 4 speakers, and we have 1 discussant. What we are going to do is I'm going to introduce now all the speakers at the same time, and they are all going to speak one after another for 50 minutes exactly. Then our discussant is going to come in with a 10-minute kickoff of the discussion, and then we hope to have 50 minutes for open floor and debate among all of us. So I'm very glad to welcome our speakers today. The first speaker is Professor Bob Deacon, who is the Director of the Globalism and Social Policy Program, GASP, and Professor of International Social Policy at the University of Sheffield. And he will open with his talk from the global politics of poverty alleviation to the global politics of welfare state rebuilding. Our second speaker will be Juliana Martinez Franzoni. She is project leader in research project Welfare Regimes in Latin America, conducted at the University of Costa Rica, and one of the external researchers for the UN Research Institute for Social Development. And she is going to speak on the impact of distributional coalitions in welfare regimes with a comparative study between Chile, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. Our third speaker will be Carlos Barba Solano. He is the coordinator of CLACSO's Working Group on Poverty and Social Policy and professor of social science at the University of Guadalajara in Mexico. And he will be speaking on how to go beyond the residual paradigm, conditional cash transfer programs in Latin America, the case of the Mexican program, Oportunidades, and the health system. Our last speaker is Jimmy Adesina. Jimmy is External Research Coordinator also of the UN Research Institute for Social Development. The project that he has finished is called Social Policy in Sub-Saharan Africa. He's member of the Executive Committee of CODESRIA, President of the South African Sociological Association, and Professor at Rhodes University in South Africa. And he is going to speak on poverty reduction and social policy in Africa. When is supranationality a fatal distraction. So we have 4 different but coherent papers. So we will have our last intervention by San Moyo from Zimbabwe, and he is the president of Codestria. So with further ado, I give the floor to Bob. Bob, you have 15 minutes. I will wave at you the yellow car and then the red car. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. This paper follows, I think, nicely on from the session that some of you were at yesterday on governance and development that told the story of structural adjustment and its damaging impacts on the African continent and elsewhere, and addressed what was to be done in terms of rebuilding democratic developmental welfare states within that continent. The focus of this paper is narrower than that discussion yesterday. It's on social policy, and it's on the social policy aspects of that process. And its focus is really the discourse and practice of the global agencies and the donor communities towards the issue of social policy in a development context. The title captures the basic point and argument. We've lived through, in the 1990s and the first decade of this century, what I call the global politics of poverty reduction. This now has to give way, in my view, to the global politics of welfare state rebuilding, or, if you prefer the term, developmental state rebuilding. Let me just work this technology.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. The global politics of poverty reduction resulted from the World Bank's tour around the world with its beneficiary index, which demonstrated that the social provision in post-colonial African states, the pay-as-you-go wage-related systems in Latin America, met the welfare needs of the few and not the many. Those who lived in cities, the urban elites, the professional classes, the state builders, and so on. And what the bank did was to argue against this system in terms of some notion of social justice, and sought an alliance with the poor, using the agency of NGOs to destroy that public provision for the sector of the population that had it already provided for them. So it was a destruction of the embryonic, partial, incomplete, universalistic welfare states of Africa, Latin America, and parts of South Asia. The OECD DAC poverty targets, the MDGs targeting on the poor, followed from that logic. And that logic pushed to one side the more comprehensive, universalistic logic of the Copenhagen Social Summit of 1995. What the technocrats of poverty alleviation didn't understand were the lessons of universal welfare state building within Europe and parts of East Asia. That project was never primarily about meeting the needs of the poor. The poor got their needs met as a consequence of the development of universalistic welfare states which met the needs of other categories of people, organised working class, the middle class, the professionals. The trick was to buy in the middle class to that process through one means or another. We know from social research, the work of Goodin on the real words of welfare, the work of Marotta and Jolly on social policy in a development context, that universal provisioning ensures the better meeting of the needs of the poor. Whatever you want to do in terms of welfare objectives within the global north, social democracy is better than conservatism, better than liberalism. In the global south, whatever you want to do, the universal provisioning of social services ensures a higher development of human capacities and capabilities. So we know from social research that is the result. The global politics of poverty alleviation didn't understand that story. But, excuse me, it is not a simple question of retracing those nationally based state building stories in the current period, because of the impact of globalization in general and the aid business in particular on the location, the nature, the aspirations, the identities of the middle class within these damaged states. In other words, the social bonds that need to be constructed between different social groups have been damaged by that process of globalization and that process of aid delivery via NGOs. I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. Let me restate why the middle class needs to be focused on. And this is the argument I think I've probably already put about the need for cross-class alliances and meeting the needs of different social groups, including those of the state builders. So this is what's needed. It summarizes, I think, some of what I've been saying. Focus on the poor undermines the middle class commitment to pay taxes. Countries need all the things that the global politics of poverty alleviation have ignored. They need higher education as well as primary, city hospitals as well as rural clinics, wage-related pensions as well as social cash transfers, and so on. And we need to pay civil servants, judges, tax collectors more money in order to rebuild an effective state that has the capacity to raise revenues and a capacity to deliver services. Without the essential infrastructure of state capacity, which involves employing those people, we won't solve the problems of poverty. Now, this issue is, maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself, that's restating the problem. Can we do that in a globalized context where, if you like, some of the fraction of the middle class in some developing countries have already distanced themselves from that project of rebuilding their states, have become outward-looking, aspire to have their needs met in a global market, send their sons and daughters to private higher education institutions across the world, tap into global private provisions of pensions, and so on. If the middle class is disconnected in terms of its aspiration, in terms of its welfare needs, how does one rebuild those contracts? This problem that I've been capturing in summary is the subject of current scholarly work. Just one or two examples of that. This is a colleague of mine, Shana Cohen, in the University of Sheffield, who did some work on Morocco and interviewed, if you like, those people who in the past might have seen their job as being state builders in the Moroccan context and were enchanted with that idea and perceive their futures as somehow or other lying outside the borders of Morocco. A rather trenchant criticism by Jeremy Gould of the aid architecture is, I think, really well worth reading. The global politics, no, what's it called? The politics of poverty reduction, the new politics of poverty reduction, where he very sharply points to the way in which the consultancy and the aid business, something that Makanda Weir drew attention to many, many years ago, has pulled people who ought to be working for state services out into a whole range of other activities outside the democratic control of state enterprises and the government. And he puts it very sharply there. There's a choice to be made between a self-referential parasitic post-developmentalism and nationalist development projects, enhancing domestic savings, productive investment, improving the productivity of land and labour, and building the revenue base for the public economy. It's not only scholarly work which is drawing attention to this issue, policy-related work as well is drawing attention to this issue. This is the work of Birdsall at the Centre for Global Development in Washington regarding the missing middle. We don't necessarily have to agree with all the formulations, but the essence is essentially there. That a healthy middle class and institutions that support them need to be rebuilt to secure the effective developmental state building projects. The Department for International Development of the United Kingdom, in its more recent white paper, also has learned that lesson, finally. It is essential that international partners avoid doing things that undermine a country's capabilities. And the white paper cites as examples aid projects that have recruited professional staff from government health services which are already struggling to provide healthcare. We know the story of pulling the best and the brightest out of the impoverished state into the structures of international consultancy and international NGOs. So what is to be done? Again, my colleague, Shana Cohen, is working on this, and to some extent what I'm saying now is derivative of her ideas. This comes from a paper that she was invited to give to the advisory body to the King of Morocco, no less. A study day on the middle class and how to secure its adherence to the building of the Moroccan state in a context where Islamic influences were becoming more important. So the approach is really one of fostering a set of policies which meets the need of that section of the population, while at the same time meeting the needs of the poor. Trying to develop a social policy built on the notion of reconstructing social relations between social groups within countries. Investing specifically in helping professions like teaching and medical care makes sense not only because of local job creation, but also, and this is the point we'll come to in a moment, of a global market as well. So in a sense, what Shana is saying is the answer partly lies in a return to state-led developmentalism, within which a large fraction of the middle class find their welfare needs met by working for the welfare needs of all in high quality, universal public institutions of health and education and social services, but also lies partly in the modification of this strategy to take account of existing mobility aspirations and existing international service markets. Here we enter a different terrain, and I'm not competent and familiar enough with that terrain to talk about it, but it's how one, if you like, welds together that rebuilding of national structures while at the same time recognising there's a global market in health, education, social protection, and people aspire to be part of it. And that's the problem, and I don't have the solution. But it's the problematic that requires a solution. The next slide is actually something quite different. It's here because I think we need to think about it, and I haven't thought about it enough. This is work in progress. It requires elaboration. But it is, if you like, this flip side of the coin. If it's too late to rebuild national solidarities, if globalization has pulled people out of states into transnational identities and transnational aspirations, and if there are transnational markets already operating in the welfare sector, how long have I? Only 1 minute.
You are in between.
3 minutes. Okay, in between. 3 minutes. Okay. Help. I'm almost there. Maybe the work of Guy Standing is something that's relevant. He is talking about the fact that there are disconnected classes which are both the poor and people like us who act globally. And maybe there is a transnational solidarity to be built, some kind of solidarities between classes on a transnational basis. My own work on regionalism kind of argues for that there's a case for regional social policies, partly because that is a space within which people who want to cross borders can operate, both in terms of labour, but also in terms of professional policy making. But I haven't the time to deliberate. Final. Okay, if anything what I'm saying is partly true, and it may not be, then what does that mean for the comparative research programme on poverty? When I'm saying poverty isn't the issue, I'm saying actually the rebuilding of states where the needs and interests of the middle class are essential to solve the problem of poverty. What does it do to the comparative research programme on poverty? This is just some ideas as to what it might mean, right? That we should, as well as doing all the other things, undertake comparative analysis of the way in which the middle class get their welfare needs met, the histories of cross-class solidarity building and how it was done and how it might be done, these issues of transnational mobility and the implications of that for social development in the country of origin, and other points that you can well read. And perhaps the last one, the regulatory mechanisms that might be used to ensure that the emergent global private welfare providers which are operating cross borders are constrained through regulations to provide also for the poor as well as the middle class. Okay, I think I've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. This was an excellent opening of our discussion. Thank you very much. I give the floor to Juliana Martinez Franzoni from the University of Costa Rica. Try to look at me now and then so I can wait.
Only at the beginning. Well, I'd like to thanks very much to Claxo and Crop for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to focus on a very specific dimension of our larger work on welfare regimes in Latin America. So are societal coalitions a prerequisite to promote redistribution in Latin America? I want to address this question by looking at two specific sub-questions. The first one is whether social policy is currently contributing to redistribution in Latin America. And we explore responses to this question by looking at qualitatively different constellations of labor markets, social policies, and families in Latin America. We have there quite three worlds of Latin American welfare, if I may borrow from Stig Anderson's three worlds of capitalism, developed capitalism in the global north. We have a world where we can find powerful domestic markets where people can make a living staying in their own countries with an average GNP of $6,000 per year, as in Chile. But we also have a world like El Salvador where 18% of the GNP is made out of remittances, and a large proportion of the population has to leave the country in order to make ends meet, and where GNP per capita is under $2,000. And we have another world in which a sort of an in-between country such as Costa Rica, where the primary difference between Chile and Costa Rica has to do with both have strong states in Latin American standards, but where in Chile we have social policies oriented towards human development. In Costa Rica, we have a stronger state devoted to collective management or collective risk management, social protection based on collective terms. And in El Salvador, we basically don't have a state. The state spends less than $200 per year per person, which is less than what Costa Rica spends just in healthcare. So we couldn't say that the state does quite a lot for people in El Salvador, but it does do different things in Chile and in Costa Rica. And we also have very different organizations of families with a more stronger role of traditional breadwinner families in Chile than in Costa Rica, and a relatively small role of traditional families in El Salvador. And these three countries are really emblematic for different arrangements between labor markets, social policy, and families in Latin America today. So El Salvador fits there along other Central American countries, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, whereas Chile and Argentina have similar features in many respects, and Costa Rica is placed together with Uruguay. And this is a typology out of 35 indicators that we've been working on. But if you look at primary income distribution, it's striking that these countries are not so different. I mean, if you look at primary distribution, you see that the bottom 20% gets around 3% of total income, whereas the wealthiest 20% around 57, 52. But that's not strikingly different. What's very different across these countries has to do with the role of social policy. And if you look at Gini coefficients, I mean, when you look at primary distribution, this is what happens, whereas you have Chile, El Salvador, and Costa Rica, and this is what happens after social policy intervenes. And you can clearly see that social policy does play a role in all three countries, but that the effect that social policy has in redistribution is larger in Chile and Costa Rica and way smaller in El Salvador. And if you look at spending, you can tell, I mean, you can explain why is that, right? I mean, there's a huge difference between Chile and Costa Rica on the one hand and El Salvador on the other. Although, as you can see, all countries, I mean, this is an overall trend for Latin America. During the neoliberal era, I mean, you do see an increase in per capita in social spending, well, because the starting point was the economic crisis and the disruption of social investment. Now, because of these very different roles of social policy, you see, for example, just looking at infant mortality, the difference in terms of performance. And you see that in El Salvador, 36 children out of 1,000 born alive died in their first year of life, against 10 and 9 in Chile and Costa Rica, the same as Cuba. So the second question is, what has been the role of distributional coalitions, especially societal coalitions, in promoting redistribution with these various different performance, right? This question is very relevant because the literature on the North, for example, Corpi and Palmer, has demonstrated that in the global North, in the OECD countries, to counterbalance elites, progressive parties have created distributional or created in the past distributional coalitions with a very extensive array of actors. And we know from Spink Anderson's work that these coalitions were very different across welfare regimes. Way broader in the Scandinavian context, thinner in the context of Anglo-Saxon countries such as the US. But we do see here that we have a virtuous circle where more universal policies promote stronger coalitions, and stronger coalitions promote more universal policies. Now, if this is so, we are in pretty bad shape in Latin America, right? Because we are coming out of 2 decades of privatization, decentralization, targeting, where the state pulled away from the middle class, as we were listening to Professor Bob Deacon just now, and basically grew social assistance for the poor, right? So this been successful, and in many countries such as El Salvador, where people have had no contact with redistribution whatsoever, for the first time, the rural poor had some kind of experience with a redistributory state, rather than just a repressive state. But this been through very, very basic services, right? Basic primary care, primary schools, and so on. But with this pro-poor and minimalist view of redistribution, are there any chances for strong societal distributional coalitions that would promote this universalistic view of the welfare state? Filgueira and other colleagues of mine argue that this is the only way to go and that we need to push for these distributional coalitions. Now, what we see in these very different countries, Chile, Costa Rica, and El Salvador, is that since 1990, in Chile, there's been, of course, a center-left government in office. Social spending has been quite stable, I mean, throughout this period of time. But you can see measures, clear measures to bring the middle class back in through important healthcare and pension reforms. Gradual reform, no radical reforms, very gradual, but that promise to have an effect, especially in the middle lower income groups. In the case of Costa Rica, you see a totally different picture, an alternation in office between center right, and although with very good press, we have a center right with very good press and passes as a progressive government in social policy, but anyways, we can discuss this. But we've had like more neoliberal and center-right governments alternating in office, and allocation of social spending has increased, but due to the exit of the middle class. So of course, if you have universal policies and the middle class exits, then the allocation ends up being more progressive, but for the wrong reasons. And in Costa Rica, we see a lot of policy inertia. The design of policies, of social policy in Costa Rica today is basically the same as it was 10 years or 15 years ago. Finally, in the case of El Salvador, we see a right-wing government in office that's increased its allocation of resources to the poor, with the state retrenchment for the little social services this country had for the middle class before the neoliberal period, the post-war period. So what we see is that the societal distributional coalitions have been fairly weak in a country emblematic of market welfare regimes as Chile is. I mean, there all the reforms have been top-down, have been quite technocratic, but they have delivered these changes in social policy. Societal distributional coalitions have been very strong in Costa Rica, mostly to defensive, mostly to prevent reforms to take place. And in the case of El Salvador, reforms have been very much dependent on sectors, very top-down, technocratic in the case of pensions, in the case of education, and very bottom-up veto points in the case of healthcare. So looking back, we see that redistribution has been driven to a large extent by technocratic elites. That means by people who think there is a way to do the right thing through knowledge, technical expertise. And that the nature and scope of redistribution has depended on their ideology, right? Of course, considering departing points, whether countries had states or not. Of course, past dependency matters, right? So we need to fine-tune the role and the nature of needed distributional coalitions. So there is hope that not only societal coalitions, but technocratic coalitions can play a key role. And we have to seduce their hearts and minds, and organizations such as Claxo and CROP have a lot to do in this direction. That means that looking forward, we can, our research shows that we can further redistribution, that involves different challenges in different welfare regimes. That in some cases, like Chile, the question is whether societal coalitions can now tap into policy formation or not. There's a lot of pressure for that coming from below, and a lot of reluctance from technocratic elites to let that happen, as the educational reform shows. In Costa Rica, we have the big question is whether elites and societal coalitions can actually build alliances versus having elites sort of like furthering, pushing for more neoliberal reforms still, as we speak, and societal coalitions pushing to prevent that reform. And in El Salvador, the question is whether this progressive elite coalition that's about to take office next month can work along societal coalitions. And because the social deficit in El Salvador is so huge, there will be, I think, a complex game between detachment from societal coalitions and engaging with them, so to sort of like deal with the pressures for social services with extremely hard fiscal constraints. So in short, I don't think the problem is in and of itself technocracy, but technocratic ideology regarding two dimensions. Substantive matters, that is, what's their paradigm, whether they are pushing to overcome poverty or whether they are pushing for citizenship and universalism, but also technocrats' view of policy formation. Do they think collective action can help, or they always think collective action is a problem, is something that will mess things up in countries that are such as Salvador or Chile, coming out of authoritarianism, and people fear that anything can take them back to the war, can take them back to a right-wing authoritarian government, and so on. So the alliances between progressive governments and collective actors depends to a large extent of how these technocratic elites see these matters. And so the question I leave to you is how we promote good technocracy. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Juliana. Thank you very much. This is a wonderful illustration of how we get from the general points made by Bob Deacon to a concrete case study with a series of sets of recommendations. We follow in our discussion with Carlos. Okay. Carlos Barbasolana, getting into the minimalist.
And could you help me to start?
Yes.
Well, first I would like to thank you the invitation of Rob and Claxo to be here today. And what I'm going to talk about follows the previous presentations. I'm Carlos Barba, this is mine. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. The paper is about how to go beyond the liberal or residual paradigm in Latin America, and is basically concerned about a new type of programs that have become like conventional tools in the region that are called conditional cash transfer programs. And I'm going to look just briefly to the case of the Mexico's Opportunities Program. First, I would like to start talking about some concepts that are important to understand what is going on. Although social welfare is considered as being located in the public sphere because it concerns to citizens, governments, and social organizations, and because it requires states' regulation and interventions, after the economic crisis of 1970s, and especially in Latin America, the response to problems like poverty, health, education, or employment was displaced into a space fundamentally dominated by the expertise of a group of neoliberal technocrats who repress the ethical aspects of public decision and limit citizen participation, converting such problems into mere technical issues. This technocratization disguised behind a facade of objective necessities the organized social interests that really determine the function, direction, and rhythm of social and technological development. For this reason, it makes sense, I would say a lot of sense, to speak in Bourdieu's terms of a welfare field, in which we encounter manifestations of positions that are not only related to intellectual traditions, but which are also anchored in certain forms of power or symbolic capital. In academic fields, these positions crystallize in the form of paradigms, which are far more formalized than discourses. Paradigms are not restricted to the scientific communities. They also include the practice of technocratic elites on both the national and transnational level. For this reason, paradigms are fundamental for decision making. In Latin America, the area of public welfare should be conceived precisely as a battlefield where different paradigms contend in order to influence not only the conceptualization of poverty or inequality, but also the very formulation of social policies. These paradigms are crucial for the articulation of academic and technocratic expertise, as well as for the integration of sociopolitical coalitions. It is exactly in this theoretical context that we must situate the process of socioeconomic reform that has been underway in the region since the economic crisis. For the past 30 years, the agenda for economic reform in Latin America has promoted free market capitalism, prudent macroeconomic policies, and commercial openness through a series of structural reforms. Since the 1990s, this process has been complemented by the realization of an intensive agenda of social reform with the central focus of governmental action defined as the reduction of poverty. During the 1990s, a new model was put in practice following the recommendation of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. The principal aspects are well known: a rigorous targeting of social programs, the decentralization of basic health and educational service, the deregulation and flexibility of the labor markets, the transformation of pension fund systems into systems of individual capitalization, the construction of networks of anti-cyclical security, and the provision of physical and human assets in order to reduce social vulnerability. So in this context, we have to situate the emergency of the conditional cash transfers programs. During the 1990s, a new class of interventionists was developed. These CCT programs that are much more refined from a technical point of view and which are applied in various countries, about 16 in Latin America. Their fundamental goal is to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of poverty throughout invest in human capital, that is education, health, and nutrition. A vicious cycle attributed to family-level strategies that impede, from this point of view, the accumulation of human capital by children, adolescents, and youngs, which in turn impedes the future increase of productivity and income. The tools used by this kind of mechanisms are a family-oriented focus, emphasizing the role of mothers in guarantee the effectiveness of such investments, cash transfers, mainly grants and economic assistance for the acquisition of school supplies and food, because it is considered important to stimulate the demand for goods in the marketplace. And such transfers are conditional on the fulfillment of the program's rules, which mainly are school enrollment on the direct beneficiaries of the direct beneficiaries, attendance at health and nutrition courses, and periodical medical examinations. For a number of academics and technocrats, this kind of program constitutes a turning point for social policy. It has even been asserted that they contribute to an unprecedented process of universalization of social protection because of the enormous increase in social coverage of education and health services that has been achieved through the CCT programs. The CCTs have been highly evaluated. The results show improvement in school performance as well as increased school enrollment and attendance. However, the criteria employed omit crucial aspects which cast doubt on the fulfillment of the program's objectives. Such affirmations evade a series of problems relating to the CCTs, which are rarely considered in official evaluations. Among such problems are some that illustrate the ideological character of this conventional tool. Let's take a look to some examples. The different CCT programs operating in Latin America have a high degree of variability in terms of their impact, differing widely in terms of the extent of their coverage and the quantity of their monetary transfers. 2, the criteria used in evaluating the programs exclude crucial aspects such as review of results in learning and the quality of available educational service. 3, the significance of these kinds of programs in the heterogeneous histories of Latin America welfare regimes can vary greatly. The success of these programs in achieving a break in the intergenerational reproduction of poverty is unproven. As a matter of fact, the evidence indicates that higher education levels does not equal greater accumulation of human capital. And now I arrive to the main point I wanted to make today, is that there's a line between increased coverage and universalization. An error of the greatest importance is the idea that increasing coverage is equivalent to universalizing social protection. Universalism implies equality of rights, access to the same quality of service for all citizens, social participation in the making and operating of public policies, etc. Increased coverage does not necessarily imply a change in orientation from a residual focus to some other kind, guided by the universalistic paradigms in terms of social policy. What does universalization mean? Guaranteeing a minimum level of social service for all social categories. This means authorizing benefits of adequate and homogeneous quality, and emphasizing that such benefits must be instrumented on the basis of the principles of citizenry, which means as right guaranteed by the state. Universalization presupposes a reconfiguring or enlarging of the public sphere because it subordinates the design of programs, policies, and institutions to the construction of legally demandable and judicially enforceable social rights. It also contains a basic element to relocation of social policies to the space of public policy in which citizen participation is indispensable. If we'll take a brief look to the case of the Mexican Progress Opportunities Program, there are some things that are very important. This is one of the first programs and the more successful ones, and it is very large. It covers about 5 million families, which is about 25 million individuals. That equals the number of people officially recognized as living in a situation of alimentary or capacities poverty. It is the second most expensive in the region, and it is widely recognized as one of the most successful. But if we look at the real functioning, at first glance, it seems that it is a program that constitutes a step forward towards universalism model, especially in the area of health services. However, what happens is that opportunity only adds another lever to the pyramid of delivery of healthcare in Mexico. You can look at briefly. In the top, we have private health insurance for the middle and upper classes. There's the all systems of public social security for the formal employment, in either from the private or the public sectors. Then is the Seguro Popular, was recently created, that is for the insured population who could participate where there is infrastructure for the secure. And then is the Oportunidades, which is only has a sort of a package for preventive health. And after that, you have the health ministry that also cover uninsured population, but without any of the specialized elements that you can get in the other sector of the pyramid. And then we have in the bottom the indigenous population that is undercovered. Well, I would finally want to stress some points. CCT programs are useful for extending the coverage of healthcare and education. However, they are instruments designed, operated, and evaluated according to the residual technocratic criteria, which exclude central issues such as the quality of service such programs provide, the quality of the social rights that they guarantee, and the possibilities of a genuine public debate to determine their orientation. What is at stake is the drastic reduction of social inequalities, not poverty. The real goal is incorporating the poor not as beneficiaries of social programs, but rather as citizens with the same social rights enjoyed by the rest of the population. What does it imply? And I'm going to finish with this. A social reform oriented by the universalist paradigm. The creation of integrated education and healthcare systems capable to offer the same level of quality of service for all the citizens, the same minimums. C, the reduction of social stratification and the integration of all strata into a single stratum. D, the reallocation of social policy into the space of public sphere. E, treating poverty, education, health, and employment topics as real moral dilemmas that affect the whole society. F, to consider the decision regarding the orientation, social, and economic policies are to follow as a political issue. G, that means that the what to do type questions should be object of public debate, and the how to do it type questions could be considered technical issues for experts. Finally, it means that we have the need to construct social coalitions in order to push forward this alternative perspective process in which progressive knowledge and expertise could play a clue role. Thanks, everybody.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Thank you very much. Very quickly, just to say that this conditional cash transfers is a wonderful example of these global ideas that is now being pushed into Eastern Europe. The Journal of Global Social Policy has a special issue on it forthcoming, and there is a piece by Paul Steves analyzing the case of Macedonia and how it's being spread. But I am sure that we're going to hear this type of criticism from our next speaker and our last speaker, Jimmy Adesina. Just hang on 1 second. It's here. There you go.
All right. Thank you very much, Asonse, for the invitation and my appreciation to the organizers for this session. I'll deal with the abstract of the paper as essentially here as a component, given the time that we have in addressing the issues. And what I'll try and do is, first of all, the whole issue around poverty reduction. What do we know? What is the, and I'll use just 2 examples of 2 countries. What do we know? And that poverty reduction is not a new, it's not a new discussion over the last 25 years in the African context. And therefore, the role that a new type of social policy, understanding of social policy, needs, to come on the agenda. Let's look at what are the kind of headline issues around poverty. Now, we can go into actually, the whole complexities around, not complexities, even the confusion as to how we measure poverty. The tendency to confuse poverty with social exclusion and a range of other things. That has come on the agenda, and a lot of people talk about qualitative research and this and that. Okay. What is important here is that we're dealing with the same parameters for assessment over a period of 20-something years. Okay? 1981 to 2005. And whereas the headline in terms of proportion of the population, the proportion of the population, for instance, will seem to hold constant. And we're dealing with chronic poverty here. We're dealing with chronic poverty. What you actually saw under the regime of structural adjustment was that the number of people actually, chronic poverty in the African context, almost doubled. Okay, over a 25-year period in which people like, Paul Collier were running our economies. Okay, if you go beyond the question of chronic poverty, the level of decent existence that actually will be a minimum that we'll be talking about, minimum. And here is using $2.50 per day. You actually look at the proportion of people across, Africa, just, minus the Maghreb, for instance. It's actually an increase from 73%, okay? And if you look at it, for instance, by if you use $2 a day, if you lose $2.50 a day, it's 80%. Only in South Asia and India, for instance, do you have that proportion of the population. This whole idea about the bottom billion is not countries, they're people. Okay? And if you take the example of Nigeria, it becomes quite interesting because between 1980, the set of policies that were supposed to be considered, bad for development, we actually found at that point, for instance, 28.1% of the population will be, classified as poor, and that grew to 54.4% by 2008. But if you look at the population, from 18 million to 68 million of the population. In the South African context, for instance, is 48%. Okay, and that's in spite of the huge amount. The number of people about 11.9 million, but the huge amount of money being spent on poverty. Alleviation. But the story is more complex, and this is where it's quite interesting when you look at, for instance, in the context of Nigeria, and you look at the headlines. But that's actually, for me, not one of the more serious dimensions of this when we look at what has happened in terms of the human capacity in the African context. You actually look at the bottom here of people who had secondary education. 7.6% in 1980 to 44.3%. In fact, it was better for you not to be educated than to have secondary education. Okay? In terms of survival. All right? But when you actually look at the regional distribution, and we talk about the way in which structural adjustment wasn't only just about adjusting the economy, it was structurally damaging many of these societies and precipitating regional crisis and this. And you look at just the country, and you can see where some 63.6% to 96% of the population will be considered poor, chronically poor. And you can see the regional variations, which then tends to fuel a particular politics that can fragment where elite, for instance, play into this kind of situation. All right? But when you look at the whole idea, the whole language of poverty reduction, it used to be poverty alleviation, then it became poverty reduction, when we should be talking about poverty eradication, okay? Adjustment did not only, it didn't create Africa's poverty problem. There's no doubt about that. But at two levels, it failed to even address the structural issues of the economy that was the object of concern in Lagos Plan of Action in 1980. Much more than that was the massive entitlement failure, which has now made a number of these things structural. Okay? Many of these poverty something structural. So when you look at, for instance, the framework for poverty mitigation or alleviation, you're dealing essentially with safety net. This was the, people remember the social dimension of adjustment debate? It's like we've been there before. The same people who crafted it are the ones telling us again how to do something that failed, repeatedly. And what you have here is a poor-centric, what I call poor-centric discourse. And there are also things like pro-poor growth, pro-poor this, and this and that. As if the poor are a demographic category. Or, all men in this house, in this room, please stand up. All poor in this room, please stand up, and this and that, okay? And what came along with that was a dismantling of states. I'm a product of public education, and I haven't done badly out of it. All right? My children can't go to public education in the same country anymore. All right? And what you have here was, in fact, a preponderance of extraterritorial agents in what we call policy merchandising and policy merchants. Many of them just floating around the world. Some of them can't hold down university jobs and call themselves consultants. And what is a consultant? Somebody who borrows your wristwatch to tell you what the time is, and then you pay him for the pleasure of doing it. And when it comes to delivery, what you get in many cases was, in fact, the NGOization. We're not dealing with non-governmental organizations in some cases. We are dealing with non-governmental individuals into what we call income supplementation. And then, in this case, and I can come back to that in the point of discussion, but is the accent now increasingly, you damage the national level situation, and then you're not talking about supranational entities, for instance. So when you look at, for instance, the whole energy that has been put into the African social policy framework is to target, AU. AU can't even sustain its own budget. Okay? But policy capture is very easy at that level. If you look at ECOWAS, for instance, ECOWAS that I knew when I was growing up, it's a different story entirely today. All right? And what you then have fundamentally here is a disarticulation of economic policy on social policy. The result is the figure in poverty, for instance. So let's just take an example, 7 minutes. Okay? 7 minutes, okay? Take, for instance, the celebrated case of what is called donor-funded schemes. The Kalomo project in Zambia, for instance, is the one that has been particularly celebrated. But actually, Kalomo uncovered. What do you actually get? Reported total household coverage, 1,027. Average household size, 3.75. Average cash transfer per person in a household per day, 9 cents. That's 7.45% of international threshold for extreme poverty. I asked one of my colleagues, do you really have any respect for these people? Okay? And of course, what you then have there is a highly restrictive eligibility criteria, to the point where, for instance, those classified as food poor, only 20% of them are covered in that particular region. Those classified by those who designed the program as critical poverty, only 33%. Imagine a situation, and the object of here, this is a pilot project, it should be scaled up by the Zambian government. Do you think the Zambian state will survive if it was implementing this project, and those who are eligible, 2/3 of them can't get any help? I mean, what kind of crisis does that create, even for the legitimacy of the state? All right? Now, but let's then quickly, in the remaining 6 minutes, okay? 5.5, okay, all right. It's actually, and this is the discourse now within this whole framework, and I think my argument here is that, in fact, within the African social policy environment, it's important for us to fundamentally shift the language and the framework of the discourse. Carlos already mentioned a problem. The problem is, in fact, the poverty of poor-centric discourse. Okay? We know, for instance, and somebody mentioned earlier on the work of, Walter Koppy and Joachim Palmer, for instance. Now, poor-centric discourses, for instance, targeting and this and that, forget about what you're doing to the poor. Actually, what it does is to create a zero-sum conflict of interest between with the non-poor, in contrast to what is called encompassing social policy, not universal. Because this whole idea, the distinction we make between targeting and universalism and things like that, there can be targeting within a universal framework. We're talking about encompassing social policy frameworks. It leaves the poor to trust in the altruism of others. Okay? And targeting tends to humiliate. In fact, some of these things are designed. The Zimbabwean case and many of them, you deliberately designed to humiliate you. That's why you have undercoverage in many cases. You've got to queue up, you've got to show that you are poor, you've got to take your child with you and this and that. And social policy are not gender neutral. What Oportunidades and others do is actually to entrench gender inequity. Who carries the children to school? The mothers. Who cleans up the school? The mothers. Who then gets excluded from labor market? The women. Okay? And they are far less successful in reducing poverty. Final slide, I believe. All right? 4 minutes, okay? Imperatives of successful social policy, and therefore what should frame in terms of policy agenda and in nature of our own discourse in terms of our own research work is that it is not, and let me try and clear this in terms of discussion about the middle class. Because we can talk about getting the middle class in from 2 different points. Let's take care of the middle class. That's not the issue here. The way in which when I was growing up, I was in the same school. Whether your father was a permanent secretary or a carpenter, you went to the same school. What it does is that, those who pay tax, okay, the significant proportion of the income tax, also know that they benefit. The wage compression that we're told about Norway, the wage compression did not happen outside or streaming in of social policy. If you increase my tax in South Africa today to 55%, but you give me universal education, in which my children can go to, healthcare and things like that, I've actually worked out that my social wage will increase by at least 40%. All right? Because the people who have resources in society also benefit. They understand what is being spent on them. In South Africa today, within our own communities, within the black elite, are people who are complaining about dependency syndrome. And you have whole industries that depend on subsidy. They don't see that as dependency. Spend money on the poor, and it's dependency syndrome. Okay? Successful social policies actually tie also social funds as a basis for development financing. We know, for instance, the electrification in Finland was funded from pension fund. Okay? The industrial policy industrial parks in southwestern Nigeria was funded from marketing board surplus. Okay? Successful reduction in undercoverage requires state civil society cooperation, not hostility. And South Africa is a classical example of that, where you can have that kind of widening. More importantly, is the widespread and endemic structural poverty requires raising the productive capacity of the whole society. Essentially, they are important for sustainable social policy financing. And surprise, surprise, actually the poor want to be productive. And I had this paper report for the World Bank. The poor have voice. Well, that's surprise. You just found out the poor have voice. You didn't grow up in my neighborhood. And you know they have voice. And they have agency. Even when we talk about technocracy and technocratic something, for instance, it's not that people are stupid. People work in my development class. We capacitate people. Do you think your grandfather is stupid? No. So why do you think if people survive for 1,000 years, they can't handle the environment? You have to go and give them capacity? When development is about learning from people, fundamentally. I think importance here is solidarity as the basis for both social policy and economic policy. And it does require enormous state capacity. This is where we come to the issue about investment in education, rebuilding the state, because to set up a welfare framework, a social policy framework, requires a learning neural network state that can constantly learn. But leadership matters. This is not about evidence-based research. Actually, social policies that have worked have been based on expansive visions of society. That's what led many of those things. You talk about the Arvold and Gunnar Myrdal. You talk about Titmus. Okay. You talk about they had expansive notion of society. That's the basis of their research. Not about collecting data and say we have the evidence. I can always give me any data set, and I'll give you 3 different figures from that data set of poverty level. We can panel big data. Okay. But this is about knowledge-informed society. Don't let me go into the thing, but what it means, and this is where I end. Yes. For us as researchers, I think it's important for us to transcend this welfare regime paradigm. Because the difficulty with that is reducing social policy to welfare. Social policy is much bigger than just giving welfare to people. Social policy is important in mobilizing resources. Social policy is fundamental for building social cohesion. And we can look at the example, for instance, of how countries like Finland came out of horrendous civil war, okay, out of that. Social policy actually is instrumental for catch-up. It builds more efficiency within the labor market. We know that, okay? And therefore, this shift in the direction of what I would call transformative social policy, transformative of gender relations, transformative of the nature of the economy, transformative of the way we actually hold ourselves in society. Context matters, and therefore the diversity of instrument. But the ethics is universal in one area. It's about the shared value of solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. And I love your last sentence. Wonderful. I want to give the floor, and I think that's it's a wonderful, wonderful way to finalize the interventions in our panel, to Sam Moyo, Executive Director of the African Institute of Agrarian Studies in Zimbabwe and President of CODESRIA. I will wave at you, Sam, the yellow card, halfway your 10 minutes. Is that okay? Very good.
Thank you very much. I'll get some water. Okay. Yeah. I'll try and be brief, to use my 10 minutes very efficiently if I can. The good things about these papers is the 4 of them, I think they're broadly within the same way of thinking. So, and I don't need to talk about, summarize them and so forth, just to sort of draw out some key points that might help us in the discussion. And also just to point out some kind of salient differences that might exist, and problems with the approaches used. First of all, okay, so there's agreement that much of what we're talking about, poverty reduction and so forth, is either some form of a residualism, a narrow welfarism, although there's some growth in coverage, in numbers and so forth, is very limited, and it limits whether, if you have a rights-based approach, it's not going towards universalism, okay? And if you have a more expansive approach to welfare, the coverage is actually very limited in terms of impact for for welfare in general. So that's good. But what is being suggested? You know, there are three broad issues that the papers try to draw out. The first is really looking at the national level. What's the problem in terms of the national level of building alternative ways of thinking about poverty, if you like, or social policy or welfare state building. So that's the first thing that the papers are all addressing. Within this, there's an attempt to look, there is an examination of, a partial examination of the class basis of actually constitution or reconstituting the appropriate policies. And here I'm referring to the emphasis on the middle class as a key, okay? and there's a discussion there also about the alliances. And I'll come back to coalitions that are required to do that. So that at the national level is the first broad arena in which the discussion is taking place. The second one, which got a bit muted, that is emphasized partly in the Deacon paper, the global politics, moving from the alleviation to the reduction, but it's still about global politics. And there's this is being contested by Jimmy in the sense of the distraction that supranationality brings. Okay, so, and that's another point. The third issue that arises from these papers is the, in actual fact, what is the substance of the alternatives that are being proposed? And in this, I think the papers are not telling us much about the substance, although Jimmy's paper is trying to come up with some ideas about the substantive basis of a welfare regime, okay, the production and so forth. So I think that this is, if we can think about these three things, is that the different levels at which we're thinking and the critique of the kinds of actions that are being proposed, and cash transfers have been the main instrument. The third one is what type of global issues arise, and lastly, what is the alternative? So let me try and go back to these points and make a few observations. Now, on the state, the idea of rebuilding the state. Now, this is established not only in these papers, but it's becoming a kind of a general discussion that we are all talking about it. But what kind of a state are we rebuilding? Now, we can rebuild a neoliberal state, having kicked out the other state. In other words, there is a discussion that we had yesterday that was alluded to today, that we can think about rebuilding a democratic developmental state. But even then, I've seen ideas of a democratic developmental state which are still very inactive in terms of intervening and so on. So really, what are we talking about? That's point number one, regarding to the national level. Point number two is this discussion about the middle class. Now, I think that since the financial crisis, we have even more entitlement to do class analysis properly. Okay? If we can look at the way policy is being made in Washington, with the characters who are making this policy, how connected and tied they are into the financial sector that they are now fixing, then I think we have to take this point very seriously, because I think there's some substantive issue regarding the importance of the alliance of the middle class, but there needs to be an analysis of the reconfiguration or of the class formation processes in the last 3 or so decades. What are we talking about? In the African context, we're talking of building what Samir Amin used to call economie de trait. The material basis of the class formation is of a merchant trading. And of course, Jimmy is telling us also that they are trading in policy ideas, also from the international. So you have a certain rentier, that was your notion. The expansion of these rentier classes and the informalization, and to what extent is the traditional social movements, labor movements, an important basis of the class? Because we have, for instance, examples of trade unions being part of a new pro-democratic process, Zambia, the case that you gave here, turning out extremely neoliberal, anti-developmental, anti-welfare regime after taking over power. So really, I think that this point is very interesting, and it reminds us that we should think about what we learned yesterday, not to imitate, but to learn, okay? But also to be wary of impositions which are abstract, such as the neoliberal Taliban type of impositions, impositions of ideas which have never been tried anywhere, okay? So I leave it as that on the first point. On the second, well, I just want to say also that there are different types of social movements, okay? that we see. There's a discussion of new social movements, and really, how new are these? There are some people who are saying that even in Latin America, these movements, in spite of their growth, their effect has been very minimal. I know for sure the social movements that relate to land, reform and so forth, have achieved much less than their stature would suggest. Okay? So now to the global thing. I just want to re-emphasize the point that I think it would be good if we have had a kind of discourse and alliance that thinks about rebuilding a developmental democratic state that is interventionist. But then this is like an idea, is how feasible is it? Because what this would require is a state that becomes interventionist, that is protectionist. Yeah? So we have to, basically we're challenging and renegotiating the whole framework, the WTO, and resisting all these things. And we're saying that in spite of the way you are discussing your stimulus packages and all these things, okay, so we are entitled to a totally new way of managing the economies. And so we have to, I think we have to pose this idea in its concrete context. To what extent can you do it? Then the last thing about the content, right. So I think that we got to talk about the welfare, if we are talking about welfare regime, in terms of a substantive, concrete, material program, agenda that binds, that makes it possible to build alliances. Now, if we take, and by this I mean, what is the content of that development? What is it? I mean, okay, definitely the state has to be interventionist and so forth, be able to direct certain areas where the potential is high. And I'll just give the example of, in the African context, for instance. It's my pet subject, because that's what I do research on. The agrarian question, we have to go back to this question. We've seen the effect of so many years of the state retreating from moving the production-based productivity and accumulation, meeting very basic requirements, food at affordable prices. And most of us, he talks about how he was educated. Most of us were educated from the little surplus of selling maize in the countryside that paid for the extra school fees or the uniform, while the state paid for the books. And so the link, the economic and social aspects, the linkages through the building the kind of economy, promoting a certain kind of a framework of demand, building domestic markets, okay, in the broader sense. I mean, I think this is the answer, because the cash transfers that we see, for instance, is to enable the neoliberal model, in most of these examples, to self-perpetuate, to buy more maize imported from the US via, it's just financing an anti-production model. So, okay, in general. And there are worse issues to think about on this subject, because the responses to these basic problems, such as food and so forth, is to sell off more land, bring in more huge agribusiness. And this is happening all over the continent right now, and it's happening in Latin America, okay? Millions and millions of hectares. In other words, you have an idea in which the assets that might form the basis of a welfare or a redistribution of that would define a redistributive model of a welfare strategy being sold off. Okay, and greater integration into a very manipulated agribusiness and global financial markets. So I want to end there at the global alliance, because the whole issue is we are in this crisis because of a major misgovernance in the center of capitalism. Basically the whole deregulation of the financial system and its abuses, which fortunately many of the populations in the north are beginning to realize, but I'm not so sure whether this is mobilized sufficiently to enable the kind of global alliance that you propose, or even though it is desirable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was wonderful insight on the thought. Keep your mic. I think I want to invite all the panelists to sit here. Can we move some chairs? And then we have to be around one microphone, right? San, can you keep the? We need to be a bit. We can move the chair. We can move the table. There you go. Just sit there.
Can we pull the table across? Yeah, okay. Let me lift it.
So they are recording the session, so we need to all speak in the microphone.
Okay.
I think we open the floor for questions, but I also want, the rest of the panel to come in and comment on each other as it is necessary. Else?
My name is Else Oyen. As some of you will know, I'm the former director of CROP. My question is on the trickle-down effect. What are the analytical steps taken from the visualized middle-class society down to the poor? Bob Deacon touched a little on it. I would like to see it elaborate, but also from the others. In one of the prominent paradigms on development research, the trickle-down effect has been very important. And we also know that the development research favorized the middle class through institution building, through creating an infrastructure that mainly profited the middle class, and the poorest, as demonstrated in the case from Nigeria, lost out. We know that the World Bank capitalized on elements within the development paradigm and did not succeed. Of course, as a Scandinavian, I would love to see the Deacon model of a welfare state society develop, because like you, I believe it is probably the most important solution. But again, what are the steps that you see that the lost out poors are, how are you visualizing the trickle-down effect?
Thank you very much. Shall we take some questions? I think we want to take more questions. Okay, I have Desmond, and then you. Yes. Please introduce yourself as you use the microphone.
I'm Desmond McNeil from SUM, the Centre for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo. Thanks for a very interesting and very coherent panel. I have a question about the middle class, which I'll address to Bob Deacon, but I guess others may also respond. Putting it very simplistically, Bob, how do you define the middle class? But to put it a little more interestingly, firstly, do you distinguish, or is it necessary to distinguish, use different definitions for analytical purposes to understand what's going on, or for prescriptive purposes when you're trying to say, okay, what are we going to do about this? And secondly, is the middle class just the same as the professional classes? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Desmond. Great question. Please.
I want to thank the
Can you please speak in the mic, because they are recording the session, so we need everybody speaking on the microphone. And introduce yourself, please.
I want to thank the panelists, the discussant, and the chair for this magnificently assembled panel that has addressed, finally, the lessons that we have to take from the moments we are living. I don't know if it was for this reason or because you are my friends, but I want to give you a standing applause. And also add perhaps a hint to Bob's question about the middle class. Look what has happened to a typical exponent of the Latin American middle class. A Chilean engineer near his retirement age, after work as a salaried professional, he had accumulated a fund for pensions of about $300,000. And in the last year and a half, he has lost $150,000. So now he's willing to hear more about the rebuilding of the public pay-as-you-go system.
Thank you very much. I think, do you want to, more questions, more questions, please. Yes, and then bio, okay, please. And please, again, introduce yourselves. It's very important.
I'm Dimitri Lavadaris from the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. I learned quite a lot today. And I also learned what not to do. If you take Jimmy, I will ask him to repeat his definition of consultants, which was original. So the lesson is, do not use consultants. The second thing is, poverty is increasing. Despite all the efforts that have been made and the money that is being spent, are our statistics really reliable? Or is it a case of junk in, junk out? Then I learned a number of important developments or lessons. But what I haven't heard is where to from now? And would the ISS forum not come out with a policy of some sort on poverty? There is this little problem that everybody talks about poverty ad nauseum, but the data that we have, reliable or unreliable as they may be, they tell us one thing: we are not doing anything really. Or are we?
Thank you very much. Cannot agree more with you. I'm going to give the last question, and then we'll reply to welcome Adebayo Olukoshi, who is supposed to be a convener of this session as well.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, so please.
I was convening from the back.
So he is also host of this session.
And managed to listen to all 4 presentations. and would like to echo the speaker before the last, that this is really brilliant, for which crop should be congratulated. I will not say that we should be congratulated. I'll simply say for which crop should be congratulated. And as I listened to all 4 presentations, I thought that the time has come for us to take the comparative very seriously.
Yes.
And I really hope that we would use the momentum of this panel to make that leap. I mean, individuals have tried. Bob Deakin has devoted a lifetime to looking at different systems across regions. But if we can tie this together, I think it will make a major research impact, but also begin to help us to build serious alternatives, including from a theoretical and conceptual point of view. The second element, and I would hope that Samuel will be able to come back to this a bit more, as well as the case example you presented from across Latin America, is the politics of it. Because it's, of course, one thing for us to have very robust critiques of what is wrong with the neoliberal model. And this is impeccably done, as we've listened this morning. But in terms of the politics, because at the end of the day, social policy is politics. Right? It's politics of resources, of power, of distribution and all. How do we begin to build, pay attention to the politics of the kinds of policies that we advocate for reform? Thank you.
Thank you, Bayo. Thanks for your contribution. Do you want to engage in the discussion now? Yes? Okay. But we need to start sharing the
okay, all right.
You want to start, Jimmy?
Yes, okay.
I'm still timing.
Yes, I know. I know. Very briefly, on the question of the middle class, I think, look, I mean, if you're in the development study, we used to hear about the modernizing elite. All right? And then people are surprised that people are corrupt. When you want to create a bourgeois class, how do they accumulate resources? I'm not what do you call it, starry-eyed about the middle class. The middle class can be as crappy as any other one, okay? Self-indulgent bunch of no-dos, no good, no good. That's not my something here. You can address this issue of middle class in two ways that are actually contradictory. We already seen that in many countries, and I know in the case of Sweden, for instance, where you actually give vouchers. I mean, this is something that people like Friedman and others have been you know, in the depth of the what do you call it, crisis in New Orleans. What was Friedman before he expired talking about? How now finally we can dismantle the public education system by giving people vouchers.
Yeah.
You can rebuild the middle class by giving them vouchers, which they then use in private hospitals and private what do you call it, schools. That's not what I'm talking about here. Fundamental to this is the question of solidarity. That means shared infrastructure. Let me go back to this thing. The joy of my education was that I knew there were people whose parents were far poorer than my parents, but were smarter than me. Because we're in the same school. It does one thing. It does one thing at minimum level, which is the kind of compassion you want to spread across something. I live in Grahamstown, one of the most appalling environments. There's a private school owned by the Anglican Church that is as un-Anglican as anything you can look for. Then there is the what they call the modesty, the old modesty store, the kind of thing where the form of some of us can afford. And then there are schools in the townships. Okay? And you can see, and you just reproduce class relations. All right? And the middle class can get self-indulgent. That's not what I'm talking about here. Fundamental to this, healthcare system, we rebuild the public health services. We all use it. The significance of the middle class at that level is that the ones who have voices. So when you go into the ward, and I'm not suggesting you can have side wards, private and this and that, but we are going to use the same surgery. We're going to use the same doctors. Now, a carpenter may not be able to complain, but a professor who goes into hospital and there's a problem, the lint is not clean, can complain. And because they have voice, you can improve the quality and hold everybody accountable. That's it. But solidarity is fundamental. It's not about rebuilding middle class with a neoliberal way. There was a neoliberal way of rebuilding the middle class. And part of the fight in so-called progressive welfare regime environment have been in fact about that, where people have used a lot of these instruments to try and dismantle this state. You can't go into Sweden and say you want to dismantle the what do you call it? So what you do, you start privatizing at the level at which you can't roll the thing back, okay? And look at what Thatcher did to the NHS. That's not what I'm talking about here. So that's one point. If solidarity is important. Poverty, yeah, that's this second something that I'll try and, poverty increasing. Actually, I'm dubious about this. That's why I said, look, give me any data set and I can generate 3 poverty, something about. It depends on who is paying at that stage. And I can show you. But the reason why I use the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics thing is that they've had this long track record of using the same thing. Actually, they're all sort of politics. In fact, the reason why you don't have a 1990 data is because the World Bank was the one that took the data. They went to Washington, and this guy generated and said the poverty was 20%. And the head of the what do you call it? What it used to be called Federal Office of Statistics said that they had a huge fight. I said, look, I can't go back home and tell them that poverty has reduced because everybody knows it's increasing. And he said the young man went back. The following day, he came back with another data that says it's now 34%. Okay? But what I've done here, and you can see some, dripped and something, which has also to do with the politics of the thing. When Obasanjo came in, poverty declined. And then the other one, poverty increased. But because over time, you can look at this, there's no doubt in the neighborhood in which I grew up of the horrendous carnage that has been done to the place. Okay? There's no doubt in the town in which I live, in South Africa, the depth of poverty you're dealing with. And you have to ask some of my colleagues, you talk about Oxford and Cambridge. Will Oxford and Cambridge tolerate this level of inequality? All right? So that's the point. And the final point here in the South African context is we've got into this dialogue of the deaf. You have the NGOs who are always talking about poverty has not reduced. And then the government, I showed the public expenditure. Why is it that poverty PO has not declined even when there's such enormous expenditure? That's because welfare might have increased, but the depth of poverty was so deep. Let me give you a very simple. If your poverty determ line is 500 kronas, and most of the people are around 10, 15, if you had 350 kronas to each of them, they will be what, 360, 305? They're still below 500, but their welfare has improved. So that's also some of the complexities of this thing. But even at that point, we are doing poverty alleviation.
That's right.
The moral responsibility as intellectuals, as people who inform policy, is about poverty eradication. When you find in the case of South Africa, people are surprised. Somebody takes a gun to you and blows your brains off. Why wouldn't they do that? In Santin, people do Lamborghini festival. I mean, what kind of... I mean, what are you trying to prove? Lamborghini festival. Meanwhile, over the valley, on the other side of town, in Alexandria, is this horrendous poverty. And you're surprised they put a gun to you? What do you expect?
Thank you, Jimmy. You are powerful. With the microphone. Voice, we know you have voice. I think Juliana wanted to say something. In the meantime, if you want questions, just raise your hand.
Yeah, just a couple of ideas. One is that I think it's very good news that the vision of building one society is back to the center stage. But of course, it's a very different ballgame to build it. And in terms of of course, oversimplifying it, I think you need power, you need resources, and you need ideas. And all of these things are very important. And they play a specific role. In terms of power relations, I think, at least in Latin America, there's no one middle class. I mean, after the neoliberal era and after the deep transformations in the varieties of capitalism that we have in the region, we really have several middle classes, some of which are winners out of the process that we went through, and some of which are losers. And so I think we need to, and I think Sam was saying something about this. We really need to remap class formation in order to discuss this matter seriously. Secondly, I think, Adebayo was talking about the politics of policy. I think one critical challenge, at least in Latin America, where we are witnessing an array of diverse progressive governments, is how to deliver, how to persuade progressive governments that they can move onto a different agenda without losing power. I mean, all left-wing governments in Latin America are drawing a lot of electoral power out of conditional cash transfers that are not much different from the conditional cash transfers programs that the neoliberal parties set in place. And why is that? Is it because they don't want to change it? No, it's because they pay off. And you can ask Lula and his second term about that. And there are plenty of studies showing the extent to which Lula owes ECTs, his second term. Right? So I think there's a question that has to do with how progressive governments keep the electoral power that they can draw out of anti-poverty programs while going beyond the residual short-term patronage approach to that program and to those programs. And I think the way to do that has a lot to do with how progressive governments can lock in middle classes without losing these sources of electoral power coming out of the poor, which are the majority, and therefore who win elections. So I think this is easier said than done, but I think there's a challenge there, right? How to do both things, to move towards more universal policy while incorporating both the poor and the middle class after such a dislocation and fragmentation of services. And the third point I wanted to make is that like people who've been doing research on the Global South, such as Nita Rudra, Good and Goff in the University of Bath, have showed that in the South, a key challenge for welfare regimes is to be able to commodify the labor force. Therefore, when I talk about welfare regimes, I'm not talking about only redistribution. I'm thinking about production and labor policy as well. And I think a key challenge has to do with how to tackle the deep interrelations between social policy and economic policy, which have to do with labor policy. So that's why I wouldn't agree with giving up the welfare regime approach if by welfare regimes we are understanding really a constellation of labor markets, social policy, and families, which are basically the less state we have, the more catch-all they are, and that's one of the critical things we need to achieve in the short term. Relieve families from doing things that have nothing to do with being families, right?
Thank you, Juliana. Wonderful. Everybody in my panel wants to speak, so I'm going to pass the microphone to them. Carlos?
Okay, I'm gonna try to be. No, I have a.
Oh, you have your things there.
I want to talk about two of the issues that were raised, and we'll try to be brief as possible. One of these is the trickle-down effect that was pointed by Elsie, and I think that what is important is to go beyond this idea of a minimal flaw, and to think about this idea of to share the maximum as it is possible in terms of way of life, to break the idea that the poor have their own way of living, and the rest, the non-poor, have their own one. So it is what is needed is to, and this is a political issue, to decide to discuss what is affordable in a particular moment, but to have an agenda of gradually increase this idea to share experiences, to share the same quality. That means that quality should be, I agree with the idea of middle classes, because you need to have the same quality of services, otherwise you are not going to be able to construct any kind of alliances. So what is important is to prioritize what is important for the poor, and to guarantee in the first step that this quality is for everybody. That's my point of view. I don't know if it is enough, but this is a starting point. And the other thing is about the politics that Adebayo pointed before. And I think that something that is crucial is to understand that knowledge is also politics, and that the ideas matter, and that it's important to go beyond from this paradigm that has been assumed that the only way to do things, and to think differently, using all the resources we have. Of course, I think that it's more important to ask questions than to have answers. So my point of view is that there's no model, a single model of universalization, but we have to ask what we have and where do we want to go. It's also a value issue. What's what I was saying, that you have to put again social policy in the realm of a public agenda. We need to discuss it. We have to assume that this is not an issue just for the technocratic elites, but it is a political thing that has to be discussed. Unfortunately, not in different places. There are different resources and different political agents. So there's no answer. There are questions. But it's important to have questions. Otherwise, there's no way to answer them. Of course, I have no answers right now for how to do it. But it is clear to me that it's important to ask these kind of things. Otherwise, we are not going to move forward.
Thank you, Carlos. Bob, you want to say something? And we will do another row of questions. I have seen it.
Okay, just on the class fractions, I mean, it's absolutely right. You know, there are diverse elements of this middle class. And really what I was trying to get at was the idea that both the professional class and the entrepreneurial class, and I suppose I was relating particularly to the African context, right? We need to find a strategy to re-embed those elements in the state building project, hence the emphasis on high quality provision that secures their needs as well as everybody else's. But it's just a question, I think, of the problem of sociology. Sociology has really lost its way, right? And we need to have much more rigorous, comparative social structural analysis in a global context. We don't actually know what who these class fractions are and the extent to which globalization has impacted upon their sense of where they get their needs met. Yeah, so rigorous comparative social structure analysis within a global context is something that we need, I think, to try to make more sense of this. I want to take a second on the point that Sam made, because I fear I may not have a chance again because of the time, on the global. Yeah, and is this a distraction? And Jimmy's point about it being a distraction. Yeah, two things. Whether we like it or not, these global players are there and continue to have an impact. Therefore, the debate at the global level is important. And it's come back onto the agenda. I mean, the appalling conclusion of the G20 summit was to deliver $500 billion or whatever it is to the IMF without a question about how the IMF practices its policies. Gordon Brown says we've ended the Washington Consensus, and then he hands $500 billion to the IMF. So that debate has to continue to take place, right? And the Washington Economic and Social Research Center has done an analysis of the first 8 or 9 new loans that the IMF have offered to, in fact, mainly middle-income countries. Appalling structural adjustment policies. So that raises a bigger question of global governance, and we haven't time to go into it, but I do think we have to put on the agenda here the global governance issues, and G20 versus UN reform, the strengthening of Economic Security Council within the UN, and all of that debate. I mean, Stiglitz has given a report to the General Assembly of the UN which talks about how that might be done, and we have on the other hand a G20 which is now becoming more legitimate. Those global players are not going to go away, and we have to engage in the debates about them. That's one point. Final point is on regionalism. Jimmy, I disagree with you, right, on regionalism within Africa. You're right to say that the AU cannot even pay its own staff, and that this is a nice, fine piece of paper. What does it mean? Yeah, the new AU social policy guidelines. We have to build on it. We have to work on it, right? And we have to work on it in ECOWAS and SADC and elsewhere with the regional economic communities. And the fact that the UNDESA, the ILO, UNESCO through its MOST program are trying to empower and strengthen those regional organizations is important, I think, because African regionalism is a key to bigger markets, is a key to productive investment back into those countries, is a key to a professional class that will manage those affairs. And I do think there's a case for supranationalism at a regional level within the African context.
Thank you, Bob. Sam, you want to?
Yeah.
You have your microphone here.
Oh, okay.
You are on.
Yeah, no, I think some of the points that I wanted to raise have been dealt with, but the one there is the issue that Jimmy raises and that I've been thinking about quite a bit is this notion of the NGOization of the policy process, the class process, and so forth, and I think that when we say that ideas are important, totally agreed. Knowledge is power, and so forth. The thing is, we have to understand how we have a counter type of knowledge that and policy process, the kind of hegemony, the embeddedness of the NGOs and so forth, and their dominance with a very liberal paradigm. I mean, even the rights-based approaches that they purport to claim are very narrow rights-based approaches. And then yes, and we have to confront the idea of this different state. What is it? And it has to confront certain global structures, whether we're doing this in terms of a regional or national markets, and I totally agree with the focus on the regionalism. The problem here is that we're dealing with a kind of a functionalist market, open regionalism that exposes us to very negative, and so how to counteract that in these, so at the moment, SADC, AU have been very timid in terms of thinking in the way Alba, in the Chavez, the Venezuela, the Bolivarian alternative, and so forth. And yes, so knowledge, I think, this brings us to the idea of research. The point that we now need to really get back to build research coalitions across the South. And I really like the kind of examples, the way, the thinking, especially around power, and if we can take that forward.
Thank you, Sam. We have more questions from the audience, and we started 10 minutes late, so we start. I had somebody in the back, please. You need to come to the front and speak in the microphone because we are recording this session. Yes, I saw you, and you. So I have three, and those are the last ones.
I would just like to push all the speakers a little further and to how we can target our research more effectively at these questions of, well, that are somewhere between cultural values and politics, whether it's how can we investigate and contribute to the building of solidarity, for example, whether it's at the village or the regional or the national level, or on the other hand, to, you know, getting to the processes that are putting pressure on the IMF to stop, you know, how can we make our research effective in making those efforts more effective and finding which ones work actually to get them to make different kinds of loans instead of just
Thank you very much.
Verbiage.
Thank you very much. We take the other two questions, the two hands, please, sir. Okay, two more.
I'm a law professor here at Bergen University, and I have been missing one word in all these discussions at the conference, and that is law, the legal approach. And there might be many reasons why people don't consider that as a viable approach. But we have here in Bergen, we formed a little group called Right to Welfare, and we are in a national network of welfare organizations with 25 different welfare organizations, and participate in the Anti-Poverty League of Europe that I think has a meeting today in Brussels. In any case, I once compiled a list of all the relevant passages in the human rights instruments that concern poverty, and called it the Magna Carta of welfare rights. But how can we sue the bastards? That's the that's the question. And we have class actions and so on. So if anybody is interested in from other countries, please contact me.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, I have two more people who want to speak. Really, I'm going to ask you to be very, very short and very, very concise.
Will be. I think suing is a serious thing that should be considered. There are so many people who are committing these atrocious crimes on the poor. The problem is, I'm from South Africa, and I speak from South African experience, and what I see every day, poverty. You can see it every day. You don't even have to research it. I happen to be some kind of a sort of a middle class, and I'm driving a car in Johannesburg suburb, and I happen to stop, and the poor men, unemployed, adults, sitting on the streets, on the pavements, they come streaming to my car and banging my car. You can see the poverty there. It's a huge threat to just a security, into social security. But then people they don't take it very seriously. A lot of money is being spent. For instance, the ministry, for instance, is spending money on research, but the so-called researchers are not doing research seriously, are not taking research seriously. All they care about is, first, I think there's a lot of pressures. Academics, all they do is like they want to actually increase their earnings, so they see that as a way of actually getting an extra income. No commitment to serious research, in-depth research, policy research that you see. It's just going in and getting quick data and then using that to actually determine how much you spend where. There's no serious commitment to this, and that's the problem. And the people who are doing research, it's us, the so-called middle class. There's an overindulgence. Jimmy talked about Lamborghini show.
You need to now
and
finalize
this is a major
question.
problem. And I think these are the serious problems. You said, Jimmy, you said something very important. Can in Manchester and other places, can they tolerate that poverty that we see? How are we living with it? It's very outrageous just to see it and to think that Government is spending money, but the money is not being used properly and effectively.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I give the floor to De Jong. Yes, please. Very, very, very short.
Right. Dag Ingebø from the University of Bergen. And I want to pose a question about the limits of social policy, or you could say the obstacles, mainly the internal. Since you have been talking about the need of including the middle class in the building of a new welfare project, that sounds like a project of class solidarity, which is interesting indeed. But I would like to mention the opposite term. What about the class conflict in this? I appreciate your point about how the middle class can do good from building a welfare state. As you mentioned, the taxation contra the social wage increase from a welfare system. However, there is an upper class who also needs to participate in the project. And although participation is a word with positive connotations, there is an evil twin of participation, which is resistance. And someone mentioned Chavez, and I believe indeed that the coup d'etat that Chavez was succumbed to in April 2002 is an example of how the internal limits or obstacles of the welfare project can be demonstrated. And I would also like to see your Lamborghini Lodge as the ideological partners of whoever committed the coup on Chavez, not only blaming freedmen in Washington, but also pointing to the fact that there is local freedmen who would advocate for voucher systems, not only the freedmen in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have a very short time. Who wants to have some final words? Okay, 1 minute. 1 minute. And then
Bob, let me just come back to the question of supranationality. The question is when, not the absolute certainty there's any accent on supranationality is a fatal destruction. The question is when. I mean, supranational entities, I grew up as a Pan-Africanist. And my dream is still a borderless, what do you call it, where I can hold a passport in my hand that says a citizen of Africa, okay? The reality is that if you look at the configuration of the regional entities under the Lagos Plan of Action and what has happened now, is enormous hijacking in many cases. I mean, I can show a couple of slides where just the number of overlaps you have in what they call regional economic communities. COMESA here, SACU here, SADC here, the other one something else here, you know. Even ECOWAS. And you can see at that level the way in which the French, for instance, are able to play the Francophone something against the rest and this and that. We're supposed to, in the West African context, moving towards a central bank and common currency. The French move in the other direction and this and that. And some of my students who are this level, you ask, to whom are you accountable? To whom are you accountable? Supranational entities are important in the area of coordination. But social policy is not ideational. Social policy is about implementation. It's about the schools, it's about the hospitals, it's about the nature of the state, it's about the civil service. What we've had over the last 30 years is a horrendous dismantling of all this. And as I was explaining to you, because it's important to understand that it's not, I mean, you are the good guy, okay? I've known you for a long time. But you also have the, what do you call it, the Paul Collier's. No, it's important. It's important in this area that we should not be starry-eyed about a number of things in this direction, okay? Because some of them, I mean, look at the policies he's talking about, okay? You basically walk away from the state and you create this thing and you can leave the state out of it and this and that. We need to rebuild all those levels. I gave the example that when we talk about, there was this xenophobic attack in South Africa May last year and this, you go into depression, you go into intense sadness, but you then have to ask yourself, what happened in Zimbabwe? What happened in Mozambique? In most places, what do you call it? Migration is not instigated because there's authoritarianism. It's usually when livelihood is completely threatened. and then you move into other areas. And we've seen that. Angola is going to be one next explosion point in terms of relative to the rest of the environment. We need to rebuild those areas. That's what I'm saying, that the emphasis here is about the need to rebuild. And to simply concentrate on supranational entities is a distraction from what needs to be done. Yes, okay, all right. And ideas matter. The question of hegemonic thing. Yeah. Ideas matter. The people who took over the world, go and read, what do you call it, what's his name, the high priest in Chicago. They were considered nuts in 1970. Oh, yeah, Friedman and others, they were considered nuts. Nobody took them seriously, was a serious economist. Over a 10-year period, they seeped into the fabric. By the way, the neoliberals read Mao better than the left. Okay? Mao's work. They seeped into the people, and these ideas then float up and this and that. And then, as somebody said, ideas have to conspire with power to hijack history. We can reverse that by insisting that there's a more expansive vision of society based on my obligation to everybody around me.
Yes, and with Pinochet came The Economist. Yeah. You want to say something?
Yeah, in terms of, to the question of how to build solidarity and the limits of social policy, I mean, I think it's clear that social inclusion cannot be done without social policy, yet it's also very clear that it cannot be done only with social policy, right? And I think the current crisis in Latin America, well, I guess in the world, creates an opportunity to do many things, among other reasons, because of what Manuel was saying in terms of downward mobility of many critical actors, and downward mobility can be a very positive reason to cooperate and to build solidarity, right? It's an incentive, but. I think one critical thing we need to do is to discuss the role of local markets in building social inclusion, and at least in Central America, I mean, because we are strongly dependent on the U.S. and the U.S. Purchases, and that's in disarray, and exports are going down, and remittances are going down, and tourism is going down. So it's a very dramatic situation, but at the same time, even the right-wing economists are saying we have to go back to basic grains, we have to go back to local markets, we have to go back, to like things people used to do, and that then were kind of like 19th century ideas, and suddenly they are 21st century ideas again. So that's why I think, around some of this, we can build cooperation between, better synergies between labor policy, economic policy, and social policy, and that the economic crisis can be an opportunity for that matter.
Thank you, Juliana. Bob, you have 1 minute, because I also want 1 minute.
Okay. The project that I've been involved with for the past 20 years has been, can one reform neoliberal globalization in the direction of a global social reformist globalization, with global taxation, global redistribution, global regulation, and global social rights? I have come to the conclusion that that is a very hard job. Therefore, I've just written a book called World Regional Social Policy and Global Governance, which argues that this job is better done within regions than globally, and hence the re-regionalisation of Latin America, of Africa, of South Asia, together with the existing region of China and so on, and the EU, is a better future for attempting to grapple with these creation of new markets which are protectionists and new forms of social regulation and redistribution. So I absolutely insist on world regionalism as a strategy for the future.
Good. Bob speaks as fast as I do. Thank you. Before I let you go and thank our wonderful panel, first of all, I want to say that the organization of this panel is a south-south, north-south, north, whatever. It's this loop that should never end, and it's the work of Codestria Claxo, and hopefully a new crop. We want to be an arena to really give microphones, because the voices are there, and bring these voices to a different level and create something very important. Alternative knowledge and alternative policy, to use the International Social Science Council and to establish dialogue further with other regions of the world. These agendas that have emerged here are so important. And they are so important today because not only the current financial economic crisis, but also because of the theme that we're going to hear right now, ladies and gentlemen, climate change. I have spent the last 2 weeks really diving into the debate on the human dimensions of climate change, questions of adaptation to climate change, mitigation, resilience building, and the poor and poverty. And what it comes is extremely dramatic, and it's going to affect the most to the poor. And now is the moment that more than ever, we need to build up an alternative understanding and to promote alternative voices and research. Thank you to all of you. This was wonderful. It's not only recorded, it's going to come up in a special issue of a journal. It will be the beginning of a long dialogue, I hope, with all of you. Thanks very much.